October 25th, 1944, 8:15. Philippine Sea, east of Samar Island. The American fleet was unprepared for what was about to happen. The USS St. an escort carrier, was floating in formation with dozens of other American warships. The morning was clear. The sea was calm. For the officers and crew of the St. The day seemed routine. Another day of supporting ground operations in the Philippines, providing air cover for the invasion forces, monitoring the horizon for enemy aircraft. At 8:15, the lookouts spotted Japanese aircraft approaching at low altitude. This was not unusual. Japanese aircraft had been attacking American ships regularly throughout the Pacific War. What was unusual was the way these aircraft were flying. They were not attempting evasive maneuvers. They were not diving to deliver bombs and then attempting to escape. They were flying directly at the American ships in a perfectly straight line, seeming to make no effort to evade anti-aircraft fire. The anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. They were trained, experienced, and had excellent targets. The Japanese aircraft should have been shot down. Dozens of aircraft were on fire, smoking, clearly damaged. But they continued flying straight at the American ships. The first kamikaze aircraft struck the USS St. at 8:15 precisely. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft, loaded with ordnance and fuel, detonated when it struck the flight deck. The explosion was enormous. Fire spread rapidly across the ship. Within minutes, the St. was burning so intensely that abandonment of the ship was ordered. Within hours, the St. sank. The USS St. was the first American ship to be sunk by a kamikaze attack. It would not be the last. What the American fleet was witnessing in that moment was something entirely new in modern warfare. It was something that would haunt American sailors for the remainder of the Pacific War and beyond. It was the emergence of a tactic born from desperation, from the recognition by the Japanese military leadership that Japan could no longer win the war through conventional means. What they were witnessing was the transformation of Japanese military culture into something that embraced mass suicide as a strategic weapon. This is the story of the kamikaze attacks. How a proud military tradition of dying rather than surrendering was transformed into a systematic program of suicide attacks. How young men, some volunteers and some conscripts, were sent on one-way missions from which they could not return. How the Japanese military leadership, facing inevitable defeat, chose to maximize the suffering and casualties they could inflict rather than accept the consequences of their failure. It is a story about desperation, sacrifice, and the collision between cultures with fundamentally different values regarding death, honor, and the obligation of soldiers to their nation. To understand how the Japanese military arrived at the kamikaze program, it is necessary to understand the military situation in the Pacific in late 1944. Japan had begun the war in the Pacific with enormous advantages. The Japanese military had superior aircraft, experienced pilots, and the element of surprise. In the first year of the war, the Japanese had conquered vast territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. It had seemed to many observers that Japan might actually achieve its objectives and establish a co-prosperity sphere that would dominate Asia. But the tide had begun to turn in 1942 and 1943. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The subsequent American island-hopping campaign in the Central Pacific had been methodically destroying Japanese military capability. American shipbuilding capacity had proven to be vastly superior to Japanese capacity. American pilot training programs had produced pilots who, by 1944, were superior in combat to the surviving Japanese pilots. More fundamentally, American strategic bombing had begun to devastate Japanese industry and infrastructure. American B-29 bombers, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands and later from bases in China, were firebombing Japanese cities. The destruction was reaching catastrophic levels. By 1944, Japanese aircraft production was in steep decline. The quality of Japanese aircraft was not improving, while the quantity of American aircraft was increasing exponentially. The Japanese military faced a problem that no amount of bravery or fighting spirit could overcome. They were being outproduced. They were being outgunned. They were being defeated by American military and industrial superiority. The senior leadership of the Japanese military understood this. They understood that Japan could not win the war through conventional means. The question was, what could they do to prevent the inevitable American victory? The answer that emerged was radical. If Japan could not defeat the United States militarily, perhaps it could make the cost of defeating Japan so high that the Americans would negotiate a peace agreement rather than continuing to fight. This logic was flawed. The Americans were not going to negotiate with Japan. The war would end only with unconditional Japanese surrender or continued fighting until Japan's complete defeat. But the Japanese military leadership, isolated by years of propaganda and censorship, did not believe this. They believed that if they could inflict enough casualties on the American military, the American people might lose the will to continue the war. The Kamikaze program was born from this desperate miscalculation. The first organized kamikaze units were formed in October 1944 as American forces approached the Philippines. The Philippines held special significance in Japanese military strategy. Japan had conquered the Philippines in 1942, and the Japanese military leadership believed that the Americans would eventually attempt to retake them. If the Americans did retake the Philippines, it would represent a major psychological and strategic defeat for Japan. More importantly, retaking the Philippines would put American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. In October 1944, American forces did indeed begin invading the Philippines. The Japanese military response included the deployment of the kamikaze units. The first kamikaze unit was formed by Commander Asaichi Tamai. Tamai understood that conventional Japanese naval aviation had been decimated by American air superiority. Japanese pilots with only minimal training were being thrown into combat against American pilots with vastly superior training and experience. The casualty rate was catastrophic, and very few enemy ships were being sunk in exchange for enormous Japanese aircraft losses. Tamai proposed a different strategy. Instead of sending aircraft on bombing runs in which they might escape, send aircraft flown by pilots who had accepted that they would die. The aircraft would be explosives-laden flying bombs, guided directly at enemy ships. The pilots would sacrifice themselves to ensure that the target was hit. Commander Tamai presented this idea to his superior officers, framing it as consistent with the Bushido code, the samurai tradition of dying with honor rather than accepting defeat. He emphasized that pilots would be volunteers, motivated by patriotic duty and the desire to save Japan. The proposal was accepted. The first kamikaze unit was officially established on October 20th, 1944. It was given the name Kamikaze, which means divine wind, a reference to the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets centuries earlier, suggesting that these attacks would be Japan's divine intervention against the American invaders. The pilots selected for the first kamikaze unit were primarily experienced officers. They understood that they were being asked to volunteer for death. Some accepted willingly. Others accepted because refusing would have been considered dishonorable. In the culture of the Japanese military, in which suicide was considered preferable to surrender, refusing a suicide mission was not simply a tactical choice. It was a repudiation of the entire value system within which the military operated. On October 25, 1944, 5 days after the first kamikaze unit was formally established, the first organized kamikaze attack was launched. For aircraft struck American ships in the Philippine Sea. The USS St. was sunk. Other American ships were damaged. The operation was considered a success. From the perspective of the Japanese military leadership, the kamikaze attacks had proven their concept. By sacrificing pilots, they could sink American ships. By expanding the program, perhaps they could inflict enough damage to affect the outcome of the war. What the Japanese military did not understand, what they did not want to understand, was that sinking a few American ships at the cost of Japanese pilots and aircraft was not a winning strategy. American shipbuilding capacity was so vast that lost ships could be replaced. But Japanese aircraft and pilots could not be replaced. Every kamikaze pilot killed was a pilot that Japan did not have for defensive operations. From a purely military perspective, the kamikaze program was profoundly irrational. It was wasteful of military resources that were increasingly scarce. It traded experienced pilots for damaged or sunk enemy ships in ratios that were unfavorable to Japan. But the kamikaze program was not primarily motivated by military rationality. It was motivated by ideology, desperation, and a refusal to accept the reality of Japanese military defeat. As October turned to November and November turned to December, the kamikaze attacks increased in intensity. What had begun as a limited program involving a few dozen volunteer pilots evolved into a massive mobilization of Japanese military aviation. Hundreds of aircraft were converted into flying bombs. Thousands of pilots, many of them young men with only minimal flight training, were organized into kamikaze units. The attacks became more frequent and more organized. Japanese naval aviation, which had been devastated by American air superiority, found that the kamikaze tactic partially compensated for Japanese pilots' lack of experience and superiority of American aircraft. American fighter pilots could shoot down a conventional aircraft attacking them, but a kamikaze pilot, knowing he was going to die anyway, had no incentive to evade or escape. The incentive was to reach the target. The psychological impact on American sailors was profound. Previous attacks on American ships had involved aircraft attempting to escape after delivering ordnance. Sailors had developed defensive strategies. Shoot at the aircraft before it reaches the ship, take evasive action, etc. But kamikaze attacks were fundamentally different. The aircraft itself was the weapon. The pilot's death was not incidental but integral to the operation. American sailors reported that the experience of watching an aircraft deliberately dive into a ship, with no attempt to escape, with the apparent certainty of mutual destruction, had a profoundly disturbing effect on morale. There was something about deliberately chosen death that seemed to violate the norms of modern warfare. American military leadership responded by deploying more fighter aircraft, establishing combat air patrols farther from the fleet, and deploying more anti-aircraft guns on ships. These measures increased the number of kamikaze aircraft shot down, but they did not prevent all attacks. Throughout late 1944 and early 1945, American ships continued to be struck by kamikaze aircraft, resulting in deaths and damage. The statistics of American ship losses to kamikaze attacks are instructive. From October 1944 through August 1945, approximately 2,500 kamikaze sorties were flown. Of these, approximately 500 resulted in successful ship strikes, resulting in the sinking of approximately 50 American ships and damage to approximately 300 others. The number of American sailors killed by kamikaze attacks was approximately 5,000. These losses, while significant, were not catastrophic in the context of overall American naval power. The United States was building ships faster than Japan could sink them. American casualties, while painful, were not sufficient to affect American strategic objectives. But to the Japanese military leadership, every American ship sunk, every American sailor killed, represented a possible victory in their ideological struggle against American materialism and Western power. One of the most troubling aspects of the kamikaze program was the question of voluntary participation. The initial kamikaze units were described as composed of volunteers. The surviving documents from the time claim that pilots were asked if they wished to participate, and that they agreed willingly. But as the war progressed and more kamikaze pilots were needed, the distinction between volunteers and conscripts became increasingly blurred. Later kamikaze units included pilots who had no choice in the matter. They were ordered to participate in kamikaze missions. Refusing an order in the Japanese military was not simply a matter of individual conscience. It was a violation of military discipline that could result in court-martial and execution. The testimonies from surviving pilots and from those who supervised the program reveal the complex psychology of the kamikaze pilots. Some pilots, particularly the older officers who had fought throughout the war, did seem to embrace the kamikaze mission as a form of honorable death. They had been influenced by bushido ideology since their military training. For them, dying in service to the emperor represented the highest form of military honor. Other pilots, particularly the younger conscripts with minimal training, seemed to view the kamikaze mission as inevitable death rather than chosen sacrifice. They understood that if they survived the initial selection process, they would likely be ordered to fly another kamikaze mission. They faced the logic, if I am going to die anyway, I might as well die in a way that damages the enemy. Still, other pilots seemed to view the kamikaze mission with ambivalence or even resistance. Some tried to desert. Some seemed to experience what modern psychologists would recognize as depression or despair. Some left letters or journals indicating that they did not believe in the cause but were flying anyway because the military had commanded them to do so. The letters left by kamikaze pilots provide some of the most poignant historical documents from the war. Many express patriotic dedication to the emperor and to Japan, but many also express doubt, fear, and resignation. Some pilots wrote that they did not believe Japan could win the war. Some wrote that they wished they could stay alive. Some wrote that they were flying because they had no choice. One famous letter from a young pilot named Hajime Fuji expresses this ambivalence. I am not going on this mission for the emperor or for the empire. I am going because I have no choice. I am going because if I refuse, I will be executed. I am going because my family will be punished if I refuse. But I will not pretend that I am happy about this. I will not pretend that I choose to die. I am being forced to die. This letter, and others like it, suggest that the kamikaze program was not simply composed of volunteers who had chosen honorable death. It was also composed of conscripts who had been pressed into service through coercion and through the lack of any alternative. How did the Japanese military leadership convince young men to fly on suicide missions? The answer involves several psychological and ideological mechanisms. First, the Bushido ideology. Japanese military culture had been shaped for centuries by the samurai tradition, which emphasized loyalty, honor, and the preference for death over surrender. Military training heavily emphasized these values. Young men were taught from their earliest days in the military that death in service to the emperor was the highest form of honor. Second, propaganda and information control. The Japanese government and military completely controlled information available to the Japanese public. Propaganda emphasized that Japan was winning the war, that American materialism was no match for Japanese spirit, that the Americans would eventually surrender because they did not have the will to continue fighting. Young pilots believed this propaganda. They believed that their sacrifices could actually affect the outcome of the war. Third, peer pressure and unit cohesion. Pilots were organized into units where they trained together, lived together, and developed strong bonds of friendship and loyalty. When unit commanders asked for volunteers for kamikaze missions, pilots often volunteered not because they individually wanted to die, but because refusing would be disloyal to their unit and would shame their fellow pilots. Fourth, the appeal to sacrifice. Military leaders framed kamikaze missions not as waste or meaningless death, but as the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the nation. They appealed to young men's sense of duty and their desire to matter, to contribute something significant to their nation's struggle. Fifth, the elimination of alternatives. Pilots knew that refusing a kamikaze mission was not simply a tactical decision. It was considered a betrayal of their nation. The consequences included court-martial, execution, and shame brought on their families. In this context, accepting the mission seemed preferable to the consequences of refusal. The combination of these psychological and ideological mechanisms proved remarkably effective at generating participation in kamikaze missions. Thousands of young men climbed into aircraft knowing they would not return, believing that their death would help save their nation. But the most troubling aspect of the kamikaze program was the role of official propaganda in deliberately misrepresenting the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks. Japanese military leadership received accurate reports about the number of American ships sunk by kamikaze attacks. They knew that the actual number was relatively small compared to the number of kamikaze sorties flown. But this information was not transmitted to the public or to the pilots themselves. Instead, the military propagandists released vastly exaggerated accounts of kamikaze success. Official Japanese radio reported that kamikaze attacks had sunk 10 times more American ships than had actually been sunk. Newspapers printed photographs of explosions with captions claiming they represented successful kamikaze strikes. The pilots themselves were often not told the actual casualty figures. They were told that kamikaze attacks were devastatingly effective, that the American Navy was being systematically destroyed, that if they could continue these attacks long enough, the Americans would eventually negotiate a peace agreement. It was a complete fabrication, but it was a necessary fabrication from the perspective of the military leadership. If pilots understood that their sacrifice was actually producing only marginal military results, morale would collapse. The entire psychological structure supporting the kamikaze program depended on pilots believing that their missions were militarily significant. The American military, faced with the kamikaze threat, responded with a combination of tactical adjustments and psychological preparation. From a tactical perspective, American forces deployed additional fighter aircraft to intercept kamikaze aircraft before they could reach the fleet. They established expanded combat air patrols at greater distances from the fleet. They increased the number of anti-aircraft guns on ships and improved their training and coordination. These measures proved somewhat effective. The percentage of kamikaze aircraft that were shot down increased substantially over the course of the war. But they did not eliminate the kamikaze threat entirely. Even with improved defenses, a significant percentage of kamikaze attacks succeeded in striking American ships. From a psychological perspective, American military leadership attempted to prepare sailors for the threat. Military publications distributed information about kamikaze attacks, explaining the Japanese motivations and tactics. The goal was to demystify the kamikaze threat and to reduce the psychological impact by explaining the reasoning behind the Japanese attacks. American sailors also received informal psychological preparation through conversations with fellow sailors who had survived kamikaze attacks. These veterans provided detailed accounts of what the attacks were like and how to survive them. But psychological preparation could only go so far. The reality of watching an aircraft deliberately dive into a ship, knowing that the pilot was choosing to die, had a visceral psychological impact that was difficult to prepare for. American sailors reported nightmares, anxiety, and a kind of existential unease about the nature of an enemy that would deliberately choose suicide as a weapon. American military intelligence also attempted to understand the kamikaze pilots themselves. Interrogators interviewed captured pilots and learned about the complex combination of ideology, coercion, and resignation that had motivated them. Some American officers expressed grudging respect for the commitment of the kamikaze pilots, even as they worked to kill them. Admiral William Halsey, a senior American naval commander, gave a quote that expressed this ambivalent assessment. "These are not the tactics of sane men, but they are the tactics of men who have been driven to desperation by propaganda, by military discipline, and by the knowledge that their nation is losing the war. They are fighting not to win but to delay. They are dying not for hope but for honor. It is a tragic waste, but it is what total war produces when one side has lost the capacity to achieve victory through conventional means. As 1944 turned to 1945, the Japanese military expanded the Kamikaze program dramatically. New Kamikaze units were formed. More pilots were trained or drafted or coerced into participating. More aircraft were converted into kamikaze weapons. The attacks intensified in frequency and scale. The Battle of Okinawa, which lasted from April to June 1945, saw the peak of kamikaze activity. The Japanese military organized massive coordinated kamikaze attacks, sending hundreds of aircraft against the American fleet supporting the invasion. The Americans referred to these attacks as Kikusui operations, floating chrysanthemum operations. The statistics from Okinawa are staggering. Japanese forces flew approximately 1,500 kamikaze sorties during the Okinawa campaign. American naval forces suffered unprecedented losses. The USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikaze aircraft and severely damaged. The USS Laffey, a destroyer, was struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and multiple conventional bombs and yet somehow remained afloat. Ships were sunk or severely damaged almost daily. American casualties during the Okinawa campaign reached approximately 50,000. Of these, approximately 5,000 were naval personnel killed by kamikaze attacks. From the Japanese perspective, the casualty figures seem to vindicate the kamikaze strategy. If kamikaze attacks could inflict that many American casualties, perhaps they could indeed wear down American willingness to continue the war. But from the American perspective, the losses were tragic and regrettable, but insufficient to affect American strategic objectives. American shipbuilding continued to replace lost vessels. American reinforcements continued to arrive in the Pacific. The American military continued to advance toward the Japanese home islands. What the Japanese military failed to understand was that American casualties, however high, would not lead to American surrender. American military strategy was not simply to minimize casualties, but to achieve complete military victory. The American people, despite the enormous losses, remained committed to continuing the war until Japan's unconditional surrender. By July 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered in May. Soviet forces had entered the Pacific War in August by declaring war on Japan and launching an invasion of Manchuria. American forces had captured Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. Strategic bombing of Japan had devastated Japanese cities and the Japanese economy. The Japanese military leadership understood that Japan faced absolute defeat. American forces were preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Japan had essentially no air force capable of defending against American bombing. Japan's navy had been reduced to a handful of ships hidden in harbors where they would eventually be destroyed by American bombing or captured by American invasion forces. Yet the Japanese military leadership refused to accept surrender. Instead, they expanded the kamikaze program even further. They organized plans for massive kamikaze attacks to be launched against the invading American forces. They reorganized the entire Japanese military structure around the preparation for mass kamikaze warfare. The Japanese military produced a plan called Ketsugo, which was essentially a plan to organize the entire Japanese population for suicidal resistance against the American invasion. The plan included training civilians to fight with any available weapons, bamboo spears, old rifles, explosives improvised from available materials. The plan included organizing women and children into militia units to participate in attacks on American forces. The extent to which this plan would have been implemented remains historically unclear. But the intention was explicit. The Japanese military was preparing to sacrifice the entire Japanese population rather than accept surrender. It was at this point that the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombs killed approximately 200,000 people in the initial explosions and from radiation effects in the following weeks. The psychological impact of the atomic bombs, combined with Soviet entry into the war, finally produced what years of military defeat had not: the decision of the Japanese leadership to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender over Japanese radio. The war was over. When the war ended, the scale of the Kamikaze program became clear. Approximately 2,500 kamikaze sorties were flown during the war. Approximately 500 of these resulted in successful ship strikes. Approximately 50 American ships were sunk by kamikaze attacks. Approximately 5,000 American sailors were killed. The number of Japanese pilots killed in kamikaze operations was approximately 2,500. That represents an exchange rate of roughly 1 American ship and 2 American sailors for every Japanese pilot. From a purely military perspective, this exchange rate was unfavorable to Japan. The United States could sustain these losses. Japan could not sustain the loss of experienced pilots. But from the perspective of Japanese military leaders, the kamikaze program had not been designed to achieve military victory. It had been designed to delay defeat and to inflict enough American casualties to potentially affect American political will. That objective had not been achieved. The American people, despite the casualties inflicted by kamikaze attacks, remained committed to the war. The military remained committed to achieving complete victory over Japan. The American public did not demand peace negotiations or surrender by the United States. Instead, the kamikaze attacks had the effect of hardening American determination to defeat Japan completely and utterly. American servicemen who had lost fellow sailors to kamikaze attacks wanted vengeance. The American military used the kamikaze attacks in propaganda, pointing to them as evidence of Japanese fanaticism and the necessity of fighting the war to a complete conclusion. The kamikaze program had failed to achieve its political objectives. It had achieved only its immediate military objective: the destruction of American ships and the killing of American sailors. But destruction of ships and casualties of sailors, while tragic, were not sufficient to affect the outcome of the war. The kamikaze program raises profound moral and ethical questions that remain relevant today. First, the question of coercion versus voluntary choice. To what extent were kamikaze pilots genuine volunteers, and to what extent were they coerced? The historical evidence suggests a complex picture. Some pilots clearly volunteered willingly. Others were coerced through military discipline and the threat of execution for refusing orders. Still others occupied a gray area, nominally volunteering but under circumstances where refusal would have been socially impossible. This raises the question: is a choice made under coercion truly a choice? If the alternative to volunteering is execution or shame, is the volunteering truly voluntary? Second, the question of military effectiveness versus human cost. The kamikaze program exchanged the lives of Japanese pilots for damage to American ships and American casualties. But the exchange rate was unfavorable to Japan. The program thus represents a case where a military strategy, while producing some tactical damage, was strategically wasteful. This raises questions about military decision-making. When does a tactical success become a strategic failure? When does the pursuit of military objectives become so divorced from achieving national goals that the military leadership should be held accountable for making catastrophically irrational decisions? Third, the question of cultural values and the legitimacy of resistance. To what extent should Japanese military leaders be criticized for organizing the kamikaze program when their actions were consistent with Japanese military culture and the bushido tradition? Were they responding to military necessity, or were they exploiting cultural values to motivate suicide attacks? The answer is probably both. The Japanese military was responding to military necessity, the reality of military defeat. But they were also exploiting cultural values to convince young men to participate in mass suicide. The two things are not mutually exclusive. Fourth, the question of responsibility for irrational military decisions. Japanese military leaders made the decision to expand kamikaze operations even as it became clear that they were not achieving their military objectives. They made the decision to organize the civilian population for suicidal resistance. They made decisions that prolonged the war, increased the death toll, and produced no military benefit. Who bears responsibility for these decisions? The military leaders who made them, the political leadership who allowed the military to control strategy, the cultural and ideological traditions that made the decisions seem rational within the context of Japanese values. These are difficult questions, and historical judgment on them has been mixed. Some historians have focused on the desperation of the Japanese military situation and treated the kamikaze program as an understandable, if irrational, response to military defeat. Other historians have been more critical, viewing the kamikaze program as evidence of the criminal irresponsibility of Japanese military leadership in prolonging the war and sacrificing lives for no military benefit. The historical record has preserved several accounts from kamikaze pilots and from people who knew them. One remarkable document is the collection of letters left by kamikaze pilots. These letters, which survive in Japanese archives and museums, provide direct insight into the pilot's thoughts and feelings. Some letters express patriotic dedication. A pilot named Ichiro Araki wrote, "I am grateful for this opportunity to serve my emperor and my nation. I will fly my aircraft directly into the enemy ship, and in that moment of destruction, I will know that I have done my duty as a soldier and as a Japanese man." Other letters express doubt and ambivalence. A pilot named Hajime Sato wrote, "I do not want to die. I have a mother and a sister at home. I want to live, but I have been ordered to fly on this mission, and I will obey. Perhaps my death will help Japan. Perhaps it will not. I do not know, but I am flying anyway." Still, other letters express explicit opposition to the military policies. A pilot named Yasuo Takeshita wrote, "This war is lost. Japan cannot win. I am being forced to die in a pointless gesture. I do not believe in this anymore, but I will fly the mission because if I refuse, I will be executed, and my family will be punished. This is not honor. This is madness." These letters reveal that the kamikaze pilots were not monolithic in their motivations or their beliefs. They included true believers in the Japanese military cause, conscripts who had no choice, reluctant participants who believed the war was already lost, and everything in between. What unites them is the fact that they all died. Whatever their individual thoughts or feelings, the outcome was the same. They flew aircraft that were loaded with explosives directly at enemy targets with no possibility of escape or survival. For American sailors who experienced kamikaze attacks, the experience was traumatic in ways that differed from conventional combat. In conventional naval combat, sailors knew that their ship might be struck by enemy fire, but they also knew that the enemy was trying to escape, that the enemy was trying to survive. There was a sense of mutual humanity. We are both trying to kill each other, but we are both trying to survive as well. Kamikaze attacks violated this assumption. The enemy pilot was not trying to survive. The enemy pilot had deliberately chosen death. The attack carried a psychological weight that went beyond mere military threat. American survivors of kamikaze attacks reported various psychological responses. Some reported a kind of numb shock, the inability to fully process what had happened. Some reported rage and a desire for revenge. Some reported a kind of philosophical resignation, an acceptance that they were caught in a war that had transcended normal human limitations. One American sailor named Robert Shuck, who survived a kamikaze attack on the USS Bunker Hill, described the experience. "We were standing watch when we saw the aircraft diving toward us. Everyone was shooting, but it seemed to happen in slow motion. The aircraft was on fire, smoking, but it kept coming. We all understood that we were about to be hit. In that final second before impact, I thought about my family back home, about whether I would survive this, about the fact that I was about to be part of history whether I wanted to be or not. Then there was an explosion. Everything was fire and smoke. My friend Tom was hit by shrapnel and died almost immediately. I was thrown to the deck. My arm was badly burned. I spent months in the hospital recovering. What haunted me was not the pain of the injury, but the psychological reality of what had happened. That pilot knew he was going to die. He chose to die in order to kill me. There was something about that deliberate choice to die that seemed to violate the normal rules of warfare. It haunted me for years. These accounts, repeated across thousands of American sailors who experienced kamikaze attacks, created a collective psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate military casualties. For Japanese society, the kamikaze program represents a more complex and contested legacy. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the kamikaze pilots were often remembered as tragic heroes, young men who had sacrificed themselves for their nation. This narrative emphasized patriotism, sacrifice, and the nobility of death for a cause greater than oneself. But as decades passed and more information became available about the coercive aspects of the kamikaze program, this narrative became more complicated. Japanese historians and memoirists began to examine the extent to which the pilots had been coerced, manipulated, or forced into participation. The debate about the kamikaze program has become a proxy for broader debates in Japanese society about how to understand Japanese militarism during the war. Should the kamikaze pilots be remembered as heroes who sacrificed themselves for their nation? Or should they be remembered as victims of a military system that forced them into suicide? The answer, according to many Japanese historians, is both. The kamikaze pilots were heroes in the sense that they demonstrated extraordinary courage and made tremendous sacrifices. But they were also victims of a military system that had become fundamentally irrational and self-destructive. One prominent Japanese historian, Atsushi Fujita, described the kamikaze program as a tragedy of the first order, a system that transformed young men into weapons and forced them to choose between dishonor and death. There is no way to interpret this as anything other than a catastrophic failure of Japanese military leadership and of the military system that enabled such decisions to be made. When viewed from the perspective of historical time, the kamikaze program represents several important lessons. First, the danger of ideology divorced from reality. The Japanese military leadership continued to expand the kamikaze program even as it became clear that the program was not achieving its stated objectives. They did this because they were committed to the ideology of total resistance and absolute sacrifice, regardless of whether such tactics made strategic sense. Second, the danger of military systems without meaningful civilian oversight. The Japanese military, which had essentially achieved autonomy from civilian political control, was able to make decisions that prolonged the war and sacrificed lives for no military benefit. A functioning democratic system with robust civilian control would have been more likely to terminate the kamikaze program once its ineffectiveness became clear. Third, the capacity of propaganda and information control to create false consciousness. The Japanese military maintained support for the kamikaze program partly through propaganda that misrepresented its effectiveness. If pilots and the Japanese public had been informed of the actual casualty rates and ship sinking rates, support for the program might have been different. Fourth, the malleability of human psychology and culture. The kamikaze program demonstrates that cultural values, military ideology, peer pressure, and institutional coercion can combine to overcome normal human instinct for self-preservation. Young men who presumably wanted to live were induced to participate in suicide attacks through a combination of cultural, psychological, and coercive mechanisms. Fifth, the ultimate futility of sacrificing human life for unachievable military objectives. The Kamikaze program cost the lives of approximately 2,500 pilots and approximately 5,000 American sailors. But it did not achieve any meaningful military benefit. It did not slow the American advance. It did not affect the outcome of the war. It simply added to the death toll without producing any corresponding military advantage to Japan. This is the essence of the tragedy. Lives were sacrificed not to achieve victory, but simply to prolong a war that was already lost. The pilots died not to win, but to delay. The American sailors died not to lose, but simply because they were in the path of an enemy that had chosen desperation over surrender. At the heart of the Kamikaze program lies a fundamental question. What does it mean to die with honor? The Japanese military framed kamikaze attacks as the ultimate expression of honor, the willingness to sacrifice one's life for something greater than oneself. The bushido tradition, from which this frame was drawn, had glorified death in service to one's lord or nation. But there is a distinction between choosing death as a necessary consequence of achieving a military objective and choosing death itself as the objective. A soldier who fights to defend his nation, knowing that he might die in that defense, is making a meaningful choice. He is accepting the risk of death in order to achieve something: the defense of his nation, the protection of his home, the defeat of an enemy. But a kamikaze pilot, in many cases, was not fighting to achieve a military objective. The pilot was flying to his death with the full knowledge that his death would not achieve military victory. In many cases, the pilot understood that the war was already lost, and that his death would simply prolong the dying. Is this honor, or is it simply death? Is this sacrifice, or is it simply waste? The answer depends partly on perspective and partly on the specific circumstances of each pilot. For some pilots who genuinely believed in the righteousness of Japan's cause and believed that their sacrifice might contribute to victory, the kamikaze program represented a form of honor. For other pilots who understood the war was lost but flew anyway because they had no choice, the experience was closer to tragedy than honor. Their death was not chosen as an expression of principle, but endured as an unavoidable consequence of military discipline and social pressure. A pilot named Takashi Yamamoto, whose letters survived the war, expressed this distinction clearly. "I would have preferred to live. I am young, and I want to live, but I am being ordered to die. They tell me that dying in this way is honorable. Perhaps it is. Or perhaps it is simply the end of my life." From a purely technological perspective, the kamikaze program represents an interesting approach to suicide weapon design. The Japanese initially converted standard fighter aircraft into kamikaze weapons by simply loading them with explosives. But as the war progressed, the Japanese developed purpose-built suicide weapons. The most famous of these was the Oka Cherry Blossom, a crude flying bomb that was essentially a piloted missile. The Oka was a small aircraft consisting largely of a fuselage filled with explosives and a cockpit for the pilot. It had minimal wings and no conventional landing gear. It was designed to be carried by a larger aircraft to within range of an American ship, then released to glide toward the target under the pilot's control before diving into the ship in a final attack. The Oka represented the ultimate refinement of the kamikaze concept, a weapon system specifically designed to ensure pilot death. It was elegant in its simplicity, essentially a human-guided bomb that combined aerodynamics, explosives, and human sacrifice into a single system. Approximately 900 Oka aircraft were produced during the war. Only about 50 of them were actually used in combat operations. Of these, only a handful resulted in successful ship strikes. The Oka's effectiveness was limited because American forces rapidly adapted their defenses, and the Oka's limited range and maneuverability made it vulnerable to American fighter aircraft. But the Oka represented the logical endpoint of the kamikaze strategy, the complete elimination of any possibility of pilot survival, the complete dedication of the entire aircraft to the delivery of explosives to the target. From an engineering perspective, the Oka was a remarkable achievement. Japanese engineers had designed a weapon system that perfectly served its purpose, ensuring that a pilot and explosives would reach a target and detonate together. From a human perspective, the Oka represented the ultimate dehumanization of warfare, the transformation of a human being into a component of a weapon system. For American military and political leadership, the kamikaze attacks raised profound strategic questions. The attacks demonstrated that conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands would be extraordinarily costly in American lives. Military planners estimated that an invasion of Japan could result in 500,000 to 1 million American casualties. When combined with the likely Japanese casualties from the bombing and invasion, the total death toll could exceed 5 million. These estimates were communicated to President Harry Truman and influenced his decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. The argument at the time was essentially, kamikaze attacks demonstrate that Japanese forces, despite their military defeat, are willing to sacrifice unlimited numbers of lives rather than surrender. An invasion of Japan would therefore be extraordinarily costly. The atomic bomb provides an alternative that could end the war without the necessity of an invasion and the resulting casualties. This calculation has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue that the atomic bomb was justified because it prevented even greater casualties from an invasion. Others argue that Japan was on the verge of surrender anyway, that the atomic bomb was unnecessary, and that it represented an act of mass murder of civilians. The historical evidence is complex. There are indications that some Japanese military leaders were prepared to continue fighting even after an invasion began. There are also indications that Japanese political leadership was seeking some way to end the war before an invasion occurred. The kamikaze attacks are relevant to this debate because they demonstrate that at least some portion of the Japanese military was prepared to sacrifice everything rather than accept surrender. Whether this justifies the use of atomic weapons remains a matter of historical and moral debate. In the decades after the war, the kamikaze program became a subject of fascination and myth in both Japanese and American culture. In Japan, the kamikaze pilots were often portrayed as noble warriors who had sacrificed themselves for their nation. This narrative was particularly strong in the 1950s and 1960s, before more critical historical scholarship emerged. In America, the kamikaze attacks were portrayed as evidence of Japanese fanaticism and the irrationality of the Japanese enemy. American propaganda had used the kamikaze attacks to suggest that Japan would fight to the last person, that negotiated settlement was impossible, and that only complete military victory would suffice. Both of these narratives contain elements of truth, but both are also partial and incomplete. The kamikaze pilots were not simply noble warriors freely sacrificing themselves for their nation. Many were conscripts or semi-volunteers operating under coercion. The program itself was based on irrational military calculations and represented a profound waste of Japanese military resources. But the kamikaze pilots were also not simply fanatics or irrational zealots. Many were young men who had been indoctrinated into a military culture, who believed the propaganda about Japanese military strength, who felt social and institutional pressure to participate, and who understood that refusal could result in death or shame to their families. The kamikaze program represents something more complex than either the noble sacrifice narrative or the fanaticism narrative. It represents a collision between military desperation, ideological commitment, cultural tradition, institutional coercion, and individual human psychology. As decades passed and historical scholarship became more sophisticated, the understanding of the kamikaze program evolved. Japanese historians and memoirists began documenting the coercive aspects of the program. survivors and family members began speaking about the complexity of the pilots' motivations. Archives were opened and documents were declassified that provided more complete information about how the program operated. By the 1990s and 2000s, there was broad historical consensus that the Kamikaze program had involved a significant degree of coercion and that many pilots had been conscripted into participation rather than genuinely volunteering. But at the same time, there was also recognition that some pilots had genuinely volunteered, that some had believed strongly in the cause, that some had gone to their deaths with a sense of purpose and meaning. The contemporary historical understanding of the Kamikaze program reflects this complexity. The pilots are understood not as simple heroes or simple victims, but as human beings caught in extraordinary circumstances, shaped by culture and ideology, operating under coercion and peer pressure, making decisions in context where meaningful alternatives may not have existed. The Kamikaze program, while unique in many respects, is not without parallels in other conflicts. Suicide bombing has become a tactic employed by various military and terrorist organizations in the decades since the Second World War. The logic is similar, sacrificing the life of the operative to ensure destruction of the target. But the scale and the systematic nature of the Kamikaze program distinguish it from most other suicide attack operations. The Kamikaze program also differs from most suicide bombing in that it was a state-organized program with official military sanction, rather than a tactic adopted by non-state actors or resistance movements. Some military historians have drawn parallels between the Kamikaze program and other forms of mass sacrifice in warfare. The human wave attacks of Soviet forces during the Battle of Stalingrad, for example, involved similar willingness to sacrifice large numbers of soldiers to achieve military objectives. The First World War trench warfare involved sending soldiers into machine gun fire knowing that enormous casualties would result. But the Kamikaze program differs from these examples in that it involved deliberate, pre-planned suicide rather than accepting casualties as an unfortunate consequence of military operations. At its core, the Kamikaze program represents an institutional failure of the Japanese military leadership. The Japanese military leadership faced a genuine problem. Japan was losing the war, and conventional military operations were not producing favorable results. The problem was real and urgent, but the response, organizing mass suicide attacks, represented a catastrophic failure of strategic thinking. The Japanese military leadership had two realistic options: accept negotiated surrender or prepare for invasion and occupation. Instead, they chose a third option: organize mass suicide attacks that would not affect the outcome of the war, but would add to the death toll without corresponding military benefit. This represents not simply a military mistake, but a failure of leadership and judgment. A competent military leadership, faced with inevitable defeat, would have sought to minimize casualties and preserve as much of the nation's strength as possible for the post-war period. Instead, the Japanese military leadership chose to maximize casualties and ensure that Japan would be utterly devastated when the war ended. From the perspective of post-war reconstruction, this was catastrophic. Japan emerged from the war not only militarily defeated, but economically devastated and psychologically traumatized. The cities were in ruins. The economy had been destroyed. Millions of civilians had been killed in bombing and warfare. The Kamikaze program had not prevented any of this. It had only ensured that the casualty count was higher than it needed to be. Some of the most moving historical documents from the war are the personal accounts of kamikaze pilots. In 1945, as the war was ending, American forces recovered documents from Japanese aircraft, including personal letters and diaries from pilots. These documents have been preserved and translated, and they provide direct insight into the pilot's thoughts and feelings. A pilot named Koji Nakamura wrote in his final letter, "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of meaninglessness. I am flying on this mission not because I believe it will save Japan. I know it will not. I am flying because I have been ordered to fly, and because the alternative is dishonor and perhaps death at the hands of my own officers. I am flying because this war has consumed everything I was and everything I hoped to be. There is nothing left but to accept this final sacrifice. Another pilot, Keiji Matsumoto, wrote, "I want to live. If I could choose, I would choose to live. I would choose to return home, to see my family again, to have a normal life. But I cannot choose. The military has made the choice for me. I am calm about this. I have accepted it. But I want it recorded that I did not choose this. This was chosen for me." A third pilot, Shiro Takahashi, wrote, "Perhaps my death will change something. Perhaps it will not. The most likely outcome is that I will die, the ship will be damaged or sunk, and the war will continue. In historical perspective, my death will mean nothing. It will be one among millions. But in the moment of my death, it will mean everything. It will be my final act, my final statement, my final chance to matter." These voices, preserved from over 75 years ago, speak across time to communicate something essential about the human experience of war, about the complexity of sacrifice, about the difficulty of maintaining meaning and dignity in circumstances that seem designed to rob one of both. Japan's post-war society has engaged in a complex reckoning with the kamikaze program and what it represents. In Japanese schools, students learn about the kamikaze program as part of the history of the Second World War. The teaching typically emphasizes both the patriotic commitment of the pilots and the tragic circumstances that led to the program. Modern Japanese historical understanding presents the kamikaze program as neither simply noble sacrifice nor simply fanaticism, but as a complex historical phenomenon rooted in military desperation, ideological commitment, and institutional failure. There is also significant Japanese scholarship examining the extent to which the kamikaze program was consistent or inconsistent with Japanese cultural values. Some scholars argue that the kamikaze program represented a perversion of traditional bushido values, turning them from individual codes of honor into tools of state coercion. Others argue that the program was a logical extension of military values that had always prioritized duty and sacrifice above individual survival. Most contemporary Japanese historians and scholars emphasize that the kamikaze program should not be used as a justification for militarism or the return to pre-war military values. Instead, the program is understood as a warning about what can happen when military institutions gain too much autonomy from civilian political control, when ideological commitment overcomes practical judgment, and when institutional pressure and propaganda override individual conscience. When we tally the human cost of the kamikaze program, the numbers are sobering. Approximately 2,500 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze operations. Approximately 5,000 American sailors were killed in kamikaze attacks. Approximately 50 American ships were sunk. Approximately 300 American ships were damaged. These numbers are not insignificant. Each figure represents human lives, families destroyed, communities grieving. But measured against the ultimate outcome of the war, they represent a tragic waste of human life for no meaningful military benefit. Japan lost the war regardless of the kamikaze attacks. The atomic bombs were dropped regardless of the kamikaze attacks. The war ended in Japanese unconditional surrender regardless of the kamikaze attacks. The kamikaze attacks did not change any of these outcomes. What the kamikaze attacks did accomplish was to increase the death toll, to traumatize American sailors, and to demonstrate the degree to which the Japanese military had become disconnected from rational strategic thinking. The kamikaze attacks mean different things depending on the perspective from which they are viewed. From the perspective of the pilots themselves, the attacks represented a complex mixture of patriotism, coercion, desperation, resignation, and perhaps a search for meaning in circumstances that seemed fundamentally meaningless. From the perspective of American sailors, The attacks represented a terrifying and traumatic experience that violated their assumptions about the nature of warfare and human behavior. From the perspective of Japanese military leadership, the attacks represented an attempt to maximize casualties and delay defeat, born from a refusal to accept the reality of military loss. From the perspective of modern historians, the attacks represent a case study in how ideology, institutional pressure, and cultural values can combine to produce decisions that are strategically irrational but psychologically understandable. From the perspective of the international community, the Kamikaze program represents one of the first examples of systematically organized suicide attacks as a military tactic, a precedent that would be followed in various forms in subsequent conflicts. What unites all of these perspectives is a recognition that the Kamikaze program represents something tragic and cautionary. It represents the consequences of war pursued to ultimate extremes. It represents what happens when military institutions lose connection with political reality. It represents the human capacity for sacrifice and self-destruction when cultural, ideological, and institutional pressures combine. One of the most remarkable documents to survive from the Kamikaze program is an interview conducted in 1975 with an American sailor named James Welch, who survived a kamikaze attack on the USS Bunker Hill. In the interview, conducted more than 30 years after the attack, Welch reflected on what had happened and what it had meant to him. "When I first saw that aircraft diving toward us, my initial reaction was disbelief. This couldn't be real. This couldn't actually be happening. But it was. I could see the pilot clearly. I could see his face. He looked calm, almost peaceful. He was not panicked. He was not desperate. He was flying directly at us with complete intentionality. In that moment, I understood something that I had not understood before. This was not simply another military attack. This was something different. This was an enemy who had decided that his death and my death were acceptable prices for a military operation. The aircraft struck. Everything was fire and explosion. I was thrown to the deck. Everything around me was chaos and death. I survived. Many of my friends did not. In the months that followed, as I recovered from my injuries, I spent a lot of time thinking about that pilot. I wondered who he was. I wondered if he had wanted to die. I wondered if he had a family. I wondered what his final thoughts were in the moment before impact. For years, I felt anger toward that pilot. I felt that his attack was irrational, fanatical, barbaric. I wanted revenge. But as decades passed, I came to understand that the pilot was probably not so different from me. He was probably a young man who had been placed in impossible circumstances. He had been ordered to fly on this mission. He had probably been told that it was his duty. He had probably been told that his sacrifice would help save his nation. I don't know if he believed that. I'll never know. But I came to understand that he was a victim as much as I was a victim of a war that had spiraled beyond reason, a victim of military institutions that had lost connection with human values. This understanding did not make the attack less tragic. It did not bring back my friends who died, but it changed how I understood the enemy and how I understood myself. We were both caught in something larger than ourselves. We were both placed in circumstances where the normal rules of human behavior ceased to apply. We were both, in a sense, sacrificed to a war that neither of us had chosen. I am grateful that I survived. I am sorry for the pilot who died. I am grateful that we have had 75 years without another world war as devastating as that one. I hope we continue to have that peace. The kamikaze attack that killed my friends taught me that in war, there are no winners. There are only survivors and casualties. There are only people who were lucky enough to live and people who were not. The pilot and I were both caught in that lottery. He lost. I won. Neither of us had much control over the outcome. The Kamikaze program offers several critical lessons for understanding military conflict, institutional behavior, and human psychology. First, the danger of military institutions without meaningful civilian oversight. The Japanese military operated with increasing autonomy from civilian political control throughout the war. This autonomy allowed the military leadership to make decisions that prolonged the war and sacrificed lives without corresponding military benefit. A functioning democratic system would have constrained these decisions. Second, the importance of accurate information in military decision-making. The Japanese military made decisions to expand the Kamikaze program based on propaganda that misrepresented its effectiveness. If accurate information about Kamikaze effectiveness had been available to military leaders, different decisions might have been made. Third, the capacity of ideology and culture to override rational judgment. The Japanese military's commitment to bushido ideology and the concept of absolute resistance prevented rational assessment of the military situation. Military leaders chose to pursue strategies that they knew could not achieve military victory, simply because the ideology demanded such pursuit. Fourth, the complexity of human motivation in extreme circumstances. The Kamikaze pilots were neither simply noble warriors freely sacrificing themselves nor simple fanatics. They were human beings operating under coercion, cultural pressure, institutional discipline, and propaganda. Understanding this complexity is essential for understanding how ordinary humans can be induced to participate in extraordinary actions. Fifth, the ultimate futility of attempting to win wars through escalating violence and sacrifice. The Kamikaze program added to the death toll without affecting the outcome of the war. It demonstrates that in modern industrial warfare, victory goes to the side with greater industrial capacity and military power, not to the side willing to sacrifice the most lives. The Kamikaze program stands as a cautionary tale from history. It reminds us that war pursued to its logical conclusion can produce outcomes that transcend reason, that military institutions must be subject to civilian control, and that even in the darkest circumstances, human choices matter and human lives have value beyond their utility to military objectives. The pilots who flew those one-way missions nearly 80 years ago are gone. Their voices have been silenced, but the lessons they teach remain relevant, urgent, and necessary to remember.